So usually what happens is a standard project has a design phase that you start at, preliminary design phase, maybe discovery, where you're kind of getting the needs analysis, maybe doing some site maps and various things like that. Then there's a design phase that starts. Then we have in tandem, a lot of times we'll have a information architecture and a development
pathway.
Well,
the two culminate together in the creation of the project.
Yeah, then the design meets development. They get interfaced. You do testing, debugging, all that types of good stuff. It goes into production, and you release it. And then you have a party and celebrate.
As a small company, the phases of development are probably different than at a larger company. They sort of bleed together. But typically when we get a new project, we go through the standard phases of, we'll have a discovery session, whether that's a physical face-to-face meeting, a phone conference, or maybe it's just a series of emails with the client where we gather as much information about the project and the goal of that project that they can provide. We take that information, and at that point we typically write up a proposal outlining everything that they want to accomplish, how we're going to accomplish those things, and then obviously the time and the cost that it takes to accomplish those. Then once we do that, we get into development, and we typically go on a beta 1, beta 2, and then what we call a gold delivery, where beta 1 and beta 2 are tested, and then by that time the gold product is what actually goes out into the public.
The development process that I use almost always becomes a hybrid, but the one that I'm more using commonly, and I've used in a lot of different situations, is kind of an agile methodology. Agile is a buzzword you'll hear, great put on a resume, but it basically means that you break your work down into small bits, and you have someone who is, we call the product owner, someone who you're going to create a website for, you're going to build a game for. They own what you're trying to create, and then how you break it down, we use that basically to break it down into smaller bits, and it makes you a lot less stressed out to do it.
Our development process is pretty darn unique. We start by talking to the client at length and figuring out what is it you need, what sort of information do you need. Who are your stakeholders? Now, stakeholders are both internal and external. Stakeholders are people that have an interest in the website and want to use the website to perform some tasks. And we sit down with the client and talk about who are the stakeholders, what are the tasks they're going to perform, and then we rank both the stakeholders and the tasks for each stakeholder. So for instance, the janitorial staff may be stakeholders, but they're not as important per se as the marketing department may be. Now maybe they are, maybe they're more important. You have to talk to the client to get that figured out. So after we rank all that, and we talk to the client and gather sample content, so we have an idea what sort of thing's going to go on the site, because before that we'd be surprised where we would design the site, say, to be this wide, and the client would come to us after the site was live and say, I wanted to show all these landscape photos and it looks really bad with a website that's this wide, or I've got a lot of tables of data that are really wide, those don't fit. So it's important you gather that information before you start. Then, after we get that information, Jans creates some grids of designs, and these are like wireframe grid designs where it literally looks like boxes. He does this in Photoshop. We build inside a graphic of a web browser at 1024 by 768. Why? Because the resolution still most monitors are at. Now that's changing, we keep an eye on that, but still the largest number are at 1024 by 768. And usually we use the latest version of Internet Explorer because again, that number's changing rapidly, but that's what the largest percentage of people are using. So we take a screenshot of Internet Explorer at 1024 by 768 with no changes, just the basic Virgin installation, with a blank area. And Jans puts the grid in there because the grid has to fit with what most people are going to see. And when I say a grid, I mean just a blank bunch of lines with a white background where at the top it would say branding, main content area, sidebar, footer, navigation. I mean, just very bare bones. Once everybody that's at the client's end and our end is signed off on that, we then hand that off to the designers and say, go nuts, but everything has to fit in that grid. Now that doesn't mean that's a boxy design. We've had lots of designers are perfectly capable of taking that and creating a curvy set of graphics, but it's still within those areas. Now the designer can go outside that area if they want, but they have to do it in Photoshop, and it makes it real easy for us to turn layers on and off and see if they stayed within the area. And if we notice that we said the footer has to be this tall, and instead what we get back from designer is a footer that's that tall, it's easy to see in Photoshop with the layers. And then we say, hey, we noticed your footer was twice as tall as it needs to be. Why did you do that? Surprisingly, shockingly, a lot of times graphic designers go, oh, I didn't notice. Okay, please fix it. Sometimes, though, they say, well, I had this is my reason. And okay, good reason. Let's talk to the client about it. We go back to the client. The client says, yeah, that sounds good. Let's do that. So we change it, and now that's accepted. Or the client goes, no, I want to stick with the wireframe. Now the graphic designer has to change it. The point is, nobody's written any code. Not a lick of code has been written because that takes up time and energy and money, and it's much easier to work in Photoshop. The designer has produced a design for both a home page and any interior pages that are going to be part of the template. The client is signed off on it. We're signed off on it. At that point, we begin coding. So it's a long, iterative process that we feel like produces the best work for everybody while keeping the amount of useless work or work that's backtracked to an absolute minimum.
What always has to be part of the proposal is what the client wants. A lot of times when the client says they want something, they mean something different than what you heard. Or they might not even be thinking of something that's necessary to make it possible. So we be sure to always list everything that they want and everything that is needed to obtain what they want as an end result. And we list those in different sections in the proposal. And then, like I said, at the end, we have a timetable for our different deliveries. We're going to deliver, beta 1 on this date. It should take approximately this long to test it. We get that back, beta 2, test it, and then gold is when it will be ready for release on their website or release on the kiosk to the public. And then obviously a cost breakdown. Sometimes the client wants line items for different options. Other times they just want the whole figure. So that varies depending on the client. And then after that, really, you always have to have some sort of legalese, to protect everybody.
We actually write some pretty good proposals, I think, and things we always include are our analysis of our understanding of what the customer is looking for and what they need. Based on that, our recommendations, and that's usually a decent amount of write-up and our research on that, along with pricing. And then timeline. We very often provide a timeline of key milestones in the project.
Assumptions are
Assumptions as well. Yeah, our assumptions as well as our business practices and policies is included in that proposal.
One thing when I'm creating a proposal for a project I always try to do is make an executive summary. Really quick, really short. If you have to pitch this to somebody like executive type, they can read in 5 seconds and get what they're trying to do and say yes or no. That makes it easier. But other things are common, kind of a table of contents if it's going to be really long and I don't want to do it, to make it skimmable. Cost. How much is this sucker going to cost me when I get it done? And typically, for a proposal, you don't want to get into the details. You just want to get into the meat of it and have, like an idea of a team or just the high level of the elements that you want to do, and then contact information at the end so they know they can get back to you.
I would say the key team members can change based on the project. Typically there's always a project manager who will oversee the work of the various other players in the field. There will often be a programmer, a designer. Sometimes people may wear both hats and do some designing and programming. And then depending on various other needs, we may have different types of specialists such as copywriters, usability engineers. So it really would depend on the size of the project. The smaller the project, the fewer players you're going to have. The larger the project, the more people.
As a small company, we do take on various roles and the team members change. With a lot of our clients will already have a dedicated project manager for that project. So the client supplies the project manager and we usually work hand in hand with them. With just my business partner and I, we often, we obviously do things different than each other, and we have different skills than each other. My business partner might take on more of the projects that are kiosk related, whereas I may take on more of the projects that are web application related. But the nice thing is, with both of our experiences in those different arenas, when he's working on a kiosk or I'm working on a web application, we can get a different perspective maybe than we might be thinking, oh, I have to do it this way for a web application. Well, that might not necessarily be true. And I can get some advice and, some out of the box ideas from someone who might take a kiosk approach.
So most of the projects that I work on have a number of team members. Typically you'll have someone that's like a project manager, or what they also call a business analyst sometimes. If I'm doing a creative project, we'll always have a designer or creative that's involved in working the media up. Commonly in projects I work for, I have a developer that writes code. You might be doing JavaScript, HTML, or you might be doing Java. And then, so those are the core people, and typically then you might have more of a manager type in some cases.
Well, we have 3 people. So the way it shakes out is that the 3 people are me, and then Jerry and Jans. And Jerry has a lot of experience in the corporate world, and he has a lot of experience talking to people. So Jerry's job is sales. So whenever anybody calls us, Jerry talks to them. Whenever anybody has a question about their website or needs something, Jerry talks to them. Whenever there's a contract to be written or training, he often does the training as well. Jerry does that. Jan's job, he is the best coder I've ever known. This guy is amazing. He is an expert at HTML and CSS and user interface design. The guy is incredible. Now that said, I obviously know it very, very, very well, but he's the one day by day that cranks it out. He's the one that does the templates. That said, in my job, and I'll explain how this all kind of fits together, my job is really to take care of the server end of it. So I'm the one that writes the shell scripts and figures out how the server software is going to work and figures out what monitoring software we need to run and how that's all going to tie together. That's my job. So those are kind of how things shake out. Now, do we have an official project manager? No, all 3 of us are in charge of handling that. So we have certain tasks, but there's certain things that we all do.
The production process varies a lot from one project to another. For instance, I might be working on a game, or I might be working on a website, or I might be working on a little piece of code. So you have to adapt to the environment that you're in. For example, one process that I was in, we were taking a off-the-shelf video game and adapting it to be a museum exhibit, and that was completely, whatever goes. In that case, so we were working with a lot of people, coordinating a lot of people. But if I'm doing a website, that's a lot more standard. You have the tools that you would normally do. You use Illustrator or Photoshop to slice and dice and create. You have a web server and a web interface. So I'll adapt tools to the job that I need.
Our production process is pretty similar from client to client. That said, if a client's site is going to be really small and they have a very small budget, we're not obviously going to go through all the iterations. They're not going to get to go through 10 design changes that a client that has a much larger budget and a much larger website would go through. The nice thing about our process is it scales nicely from a $3,000 website that 3 people are going to edit up to a $40,000 or $50,000 website that 50 or 100 people are going to edit. It's just, the amount of work and the steps are still the same. Sorry, the amount of steps are still the same. The amount of work in each step is going to be vary according to the size of the project.